Welcome to this presentation on gender responsive planning and budgeting. I am Dr. Madhuri, working as Associate Professor in Center for Gender Studies and Development in National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj. This presentation is all about what gender and sex mean to us and how does the gender impact the relationship between men and women, and what are the gender issues we need to look into when we look at the developmental planning and budgeting, and why is it that women's needs and priorities should be considered before we plan for gender responsive planning and budgeting. Now, we often come across the terms gender and sex interchangeably used in day-to-day life. But what does exactly gender mean for us, and what does exactly sex mean for us? So, to understand what gender responsive planning is all about, we need to be very clear about the distinction between what gender is and what sex is. So, this is what gender is for all of us. Gender is something which is determined by the society and culture. Now, for example, if you look at some of the stereotypes which exist in our society, when you think of a manager, we always tend to think of a man, and when you think of a secretary, you always tend to think of a woman. So, these are some of the roles which are prescribed by the society, which are stereotyped. So, this type of gender roles differ from society to society. Likewise, gender is also not something which is permanent, and gender is also not something which is universal. The society and culture shapes up gender in a different way in a particular country or in a particular province, in a particular culture. That might be slightly different from what gender means to other communities in some other country. So, gender is something which is not universal and which is not natural. So, this is something which needs to be understood by all of us. Now, when you look at some other examples like masculine versus feminine, masculine is something which is again attributed to male as a sex, which means to say that masculine, a man has to be masculine, a man has to be more stronger. When it comes to women, they say a woman has to be feminine. Now, what does that mean? A woman has to be more gentle, women has to be elegant. So, these are some of the responsibilities or some of the roles or some of the notions which are associated with a particular sex. Likewise, when you look at some of the responsibilities like taking care of the children or taking care of the household chores, this is something which is again tagged up to a woman. This is something which they see that a woman's responsibility is to look after the children and to look after the home. But when you look at the leadership positions and leadership roles, very often you see that they are tagged up to the men. We see many men coming into the leadership roles, and we feel it's something which is natural for them, right? When we want to bring women into the leadership positions, like we were discussing, we need to go into an affirmative action mode, bring some special provisions to bring women into the leadership roles. So, when you look at gender issues and when you look at the relationship between men and women, how gender impacts the relationship between men and women, we find that women are at a very disadvantaged position. So, when you look at the equality between both the sexes of male as well as female, you feel that it is slightly tilted, not so much in favor of women. So, women are in a disadvantaged position. And it's because of this reason that whenever we speak about gender, we tend to speak more about women. So, the kind of gender equality which we envisage in a society is not visible in many of the societies we come across. The resources, the power, the opportunities in a society should be equally shared by men and women, idealistically. But does it happen that way? Most often it doesn't. So, what should we do to ensure that there is gender equality between men and women? Gender responsive planning and budgeting is one of the way out to ensure this kind of gender equality. But before we go into gender responsive planning and budgeting, we also need to understand the difference between practical gender needs and the strategic gender needs. Because in order to take up the planning exercise, which is gender responsive, we need to understand what the real requirements, priorities and needs of women are, which will improve the position of women and empower women. For example, ensuring that men and women get equal wages is one of the strategic gender need, which will alter the position of the women in the society. Likewise, ensuring the legal rights of women also is one of the strategic gender needs, and then addressing issues like domestic violence is also one of the strategic gender needs, which will ultimately lead to the empowerment of women. Now, coming to gender responsive planning. Planning, as we all know, is a systematic exercise which involves identifying the priorities of the community, then developing strategies according to the priorities identified, and based on the strategy, we need to take up certain interventions and actions to achieve the planned goals and objectives. Gender responsive planning is an exercise wherein we address women's and men's needs, their concerns, their experiences also should be taken into account while formulating the policy, planning, budgeting, implementation, monitoring and evaluation. How do we go about doing this kind of gender responsive planning? Through gender mainstreaming. So, gender mainstreaming is a strategy wherein we address the gender responsive planning. Now, in a gender responsive planning, we need to treat women as equal partners, not just as passive recipients. We need to look at women as decision makers, as change agents and as partners in the implementation process. For example, we need to look at women as farmers, not just as wives of the farmers. Likewise, in the infrastructure field, for example, if you take, we need to look at women as designers, we need to look at women as users and also as those who maintain the facilities in the infrastructure sector. Now, take the trade as a sector, for example. We need to look at women as consumers and entrepreneurs in their own right. So, policies, programs and services that are designed and implemented with women's participation have higher chance of success. So, this is how we start off with gender responsive planning. Now, when you really get into planning, taking into the gender issues or concerns into pivotal role, we need to ask certain questions. How does a developmental program affect women and men differently? What will happen if the project does not take the concerns of women into consideration? What benefits will women and men get from these projects? Do they get the same type of benefits? Are there differential impact on men and women? So, we need to recognize that women have equal right to participation when we are making the planning process. For example, many studies and experience had shown that investing on the education of mother will lead to higher education of children, improved nutrition and better health. So, when you are planning, this is something which you need to keep in mind and plan accordingly. Wherever women empowerment is higher, it always led to lower population growth. This is another experience. So, whenever you are planning towards the family planning programs, this is another focal area you need to keep in mind. And experience also shows that whenever women are given a representation in the governance structures where decision making is very high, governance is supposed to be very efficient. So, now look at the Panchayati Raj institutions or local government institutions, and how do you go about doing the local level planning and making it more gender responsive. We need to recognize that the resources of government are very limited. Now, how do we ensure that the limited resources which are available with the government cater to the needs of both men and women? How do we prioritize these limited resources? Whose concerns should we prioritize? Should we consider the concerns of women first, or should we consider the concerns of men first? Should we look at them as different entities, or should we look at them as a community angle? So, how are we going to do the local level planning? So, this is something which we need to analyze sector wise. We need to analyze sector wise their priorities, the priorities of women vis-a-vis the priorities of men, and how many resources are available with us. So, how much can we put into the priorities of women and how much can we put into the priorities of men. So, that is an exercise we need to do with the community by involving both women and men, by ensuring their participation in the entire planning process and ensure that women's voices are heard in the planning process. So, women and men, they have different needs in different life situations. So, this is what developmental planning or gender responsive planning has to take into account. For example, if you look at a poor household in a typical village, we need to recognize that poverty also affects the members of a household, a poor household, differently. So, even within a poor household, the entitlements and the resource allocation between different members is different. So, if you look at the most vulnerable member in a poor household, it often comes to us that it's the women who eats the last and she is the most vulnerable. So, how do we address this in our planning? Now, look at some more examples. For example, if you look at the issue of providing girls' toilets in schools, it's always correlated that wherever girls' toilets are not provided in the schools, the dropout rate of girls is supposed to be very high. So, there is a correlation. So, when you look at such kind of correlations, your planning should address such kind of gender issues which are specific to girls. Likewise, provision of drinking waters is very crucial for women. This might not be a priority area for men, but for women it's a very crucial area. Most of their time goes in fetching drinking water. So, in a local level planning, this is another very important area we need to look into. Likewise, wherever communities live near forests, most of the women, they are concerned with collection of fuel and fodder, and they also are involved in the protection of the forest because forests give them so many resources. So, when you are planning for the protection of the environment and the forest, you need to take women's interests into picture and plan accordingly. And when you also organize the meetings with the community, you also need to look at what are the work timings of the women. Do you ensure that they participate at the time of your meeting? So, these are also some of the things which you need to keep in mind. And issues like, are health services available for women? Do they have access to the health services, or do they have any control on the health services? How do we ensure that in our local level planning? Now, look at some of the social welfare programs, for example. You need to look at what is the poverty level of a locality when you are designing or when you are planning for social welfare programs. Who are affected the most by these poverty levels? Are the existing social services accessible to women? What difficulties do women encounter in the performance of their reproductive as well as productive roles? Are we addressing the needs of elderly and disabled women? What are their real needs? Do we have any support system to address women in general in terms of providing daycare facilities, in terms of providing nurseries, in terms of providing crisis centers to women as well as women workers as well as spouses? When you look at education, for example, what percentage of women vis-a-vis the men drop out of the schools at different levels of education? If there are more women dropouts, what are the reasons for that? What are the alternative opportunities we provide to them, such as non-formal education? Are we taking this into cognizance when we are planning at the local level? When you look at agricultural sector, for example, are women recognized as farmers first of all? Do they have access to credit when they want to emerge as agriculturalists? Do we have any women-friendly technologies? Can we promote such kind of technologies which will reduce the drudgery of women? Do women have access to and control over the land and its maximum utilization? Any post-harvest facilities are provided to women or not? Do pregnant and lactating women, do they have access to any nutrition programs? So, these are some of the questions we need to ask. We need to look into such kind of gendered issues when we are going for gender responsive planning. Now, coming to gender responsive budgeting. So, you have a planning in your mind, you have discussed that with the community, you have ensured that the community participated in the local level planning. So, how do you ensure that budget allocation is made to the planning which you have designed? So, the budgets also should support the kind of issues which are identified at the local level in your gender responsive planning. So, gender responsive budget is all about analysis of budget both from the revenue side as well as from the expenditure side from a gender perspective. So, you need to disaggregate the budget in terms of its impact on men as well as women. So, gender responsive budgeting highlights the gap between policy and the resources committed. Most often you can see that the policy might speak about the women empowerment, but when it comes to budget, the budget might not have provisions for different activities under the women empowerment. So, how do you ensure that what policy speaks is also reflected in the budget? So, if you can ensure that, that becomes your gender responsive budget. And what GRB is not about is that gender responsive budget is not a separate budget for women. That is something we need to understand. It doesn't necessarily seek to increase the amount of money spent on women. It is not an end to itself. It's just a tool to achieve the gender mainstreaming. Now, what are the goals of gender responsive budgeting? Basically, to raise the awareness on gender issues and gender impacts of budgets and policies, hold government accountable for budgetary and policy commitments, and also to promote ultimately gender equality. What are the requirements if we have to do the gender responsive budgeting? Number one, you need to have a knowledge about what gender is all about and how can you identify gender issues in different sectors. So without that, you cannot get into gender responsive budgeting. And also, you need to have knowledge about the budget preparation. So knowledge about budget preparation and knowledge about gender as well as gender responsive planning. This will help you in preparing a gender responsive budgeting. So to have a gender responsive budget, you also need to have enabling environment. So if you have to ensure enabling environment, what is to be ensured? You need to be ensured that you have access to budget preparation. You also need to ensure that you have gender disaggregated data which is available with you so that you can plan accordingly and make your budget plan accordingly. You also need to have awareness on gender responsive budgeting. Above all, you need to have political will. So if the governments have that political will and if the government can spare adequate resources for such kind of exercises, then one can go ahead with gender responsive budgeting. Now look at some of the case studies with regard to different ministries who have taken the gender responsive budgeting initiatives in India. For example, if you look at Ministry of Finance has included a column on gender outcomes of the budget, and it has also mandated that various ministries should identify the gender mainstreaming programs and improve women's access to services. Ministry of Environment, it has conducted a study on impact of climate change on women, which again resulted in taking up certain interventions by the ministry and also allocating resources accordingly. Planning Commission also ensured that national and state plans are gender sensitive. Likewise, Department of Commerce also ensured that there are certain studies which are taken up which looked into and focused into the gender implications of the special economic zones. Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs took up the issue of deserted wives of non-resident Indian marriages, and the planning has been done accordingly. Resources also have been done accordingly to address this particular issue. Then periodic review of female domestic servants in foreign countries, the difficulties they face is also one of the initiative taken up by the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs. Ministry of Urban Development also looked into the issue of clean and safe public toilets to be ensured that women get access to these clean and public toilets in the urban areas, and also to provide adequate street lighting in order to address the safety issues of the women. Now look at Ministry of Defence. Ministry of Defence also speaks about gender inclusion and inclusion of women in the armed forces. For example, look at Ministry of Renewable Energy. It speaks about provision of solar lanterns to girl students and also speaks about training women to sell and repair renewable energy devices. Now, these are the interventions which are made at the planning level, and also budgetary allocations are made accordingly. To conclude, I will also quote another example from Ministry of Agriculture, wherein Ministry of Agriculture has set up National Gender Resource Center and also increased women's access to credit and markets. So to sum up, gender responsive planning and gender responsive budgeting will go a long way in ensuring gender equality as well as women empowerment. So if you have any queries, if you have any more questions, you can look at some of these references. This will give you some more insights into this particular topic. And if you have more queries, you can contact me on this particular address, Dr. N.V. Madhuri, Associate Professor, Center for Gender Studies and Development, National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj, Hyderabad. My mail ID is madhurinb5@gmail.com. Thank you.